and getting it out. Got one. Look at that, right off the bat. Oh, they love this pattern.
Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked Fly Fishing. And today let's look at putting on a weed guard on a fly. We're going to do a woolly bugger. And it happens to be a color scheme that I like, sort of a olive yellow. I've had good luck with that with carp in the past in that color scheme, so we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to put a weed guard on it, and there's a good reason for that. Often we find carp mudding in very shallow water, like barely enough water to cover them, and surrounded by weeds. So if you cast a weighted fly into the middle of that, it'll be on the bottom in an instant. You want something that sinks more slowly, that gives you a chance, and also something that's going to try and keep the weeds off as best we can. I mean, you never get a truly weedless fly, but we can get close. We can get something that works well. Now, before I get into the fly, I want to talk about a problem that I discovered some years ago. I fish in Cape Cod for striped bass, and one spot we fish is called Pleasant Bay. In Pleasant Bay, you get these rack lines that build up on the beach. And then when you have a high tide that comes along, it picks up all that dead weed and pulls it back into the bay. So when you're fishing, you've got all this dead weed floating on the surface of the water. I was fishing gurglers, and of course, every cast comes back with weed on the fly. So I went back to the cabin, tied up some more gurglers with a weed guard. And two things happened. The hit rate went down, and it was almost impossible to hook a fish. Well, I had done some things wrong with that weed guard, and I didn't start catching fish again until I cut the weed guards off. And when I put this fly together, we'll talk about the things we have to do properly to ensure that we don't have the problems I had when I went fishing in Cape Cod with my weed guard on the gurgler. Anyway, let's get into it. The hook I'm using here is actually a stainless steel saltwater hook. I picked it because it has a larger eye. Because we're going to be putting the weed guard through the eye, we want some room to tie on our leader afterwards. Also, it has a straight eye, as you can see, and that straight eye will give us a little bit better finish when we put the weed guard in. My thread is uni olive dun in a 6/0. My tail is this yellow olive, I guess you'd call it marabou. The body is this yellow olive variegated chenille. And I have this saddle hackle in that same yellow olive. My weed guard is going to be saltwater mono. And I chose saltwater mono because it's hard and stiff. But this was the problem I had with my gurglers. I made the weed guard out of saltwater mono, but I used 50 pound. And that was very stiff. And so what happens when the fish came up and hit the fly, they'd hit that weed guard and it would literally push the fly away from them. And if they were able to bite down on the fly, it would cause the fly, instead of being in this position where it would hook up on their jaw, it would flip sideways. And so instead of the weed guard compressing, it just caused the fly to move sideways. So you just pull it straight out of their mouths. And the other thing too is, for whatever reason, when they're coming up underneath it, they were just turning away. They weren't, really clamping down on the thing. In fact, I had a lot of just turn off from the fly. Other people were catching fish. I was catching fish on that same type of gurgler the day before. Nothing. So there was something about that really heavy, thick weed guard that was turning them off as well. So when you stop and think about that, you really don't need that heavy mono to form a weed guard. All you need is something that's going to be stiff enough to bounce the fly off the weed, so if it hits a weed, it will move off the weed instead of snagging up. And this is one of the reasons why I like unweighted flies for this, is if you use an unweighted fly, it's easier for it to bounce off the weed than it is if it's weighted. The inertia of the fly, if it's weighted, is going to keep on going and compress the weed guard. Then you need heavier mono, blah, 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 visual circle. So I'm only using 12 pound for this weed guard. It is saltwater mono, so it's hard and it has a natural curve to it, but it's nice and stiff for 12 pound. So it's going to do the job of keeping the weeds off, but when the fish bites it, it will compress, so we don't have a problem. So we're going to start by putting the weed guard at the back first. And I'm going to take off a good chunk. So, put my goggles on. Okay, I'm going to start the thread at the back here. Now, this mono has a lovely natural curve to it, which is beneficial when we're putting in a weed guard. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to feed my weed guard in through my vise to keep that natural curve of the mono working for me. But I made sure when I put it through my vise I didn't put it around anything, so I won't be able to get the fly off without taking the vise apart. So, all right, and we're going to just put a couple of wraps in here. And I'll just pull this out of the way. And I'll keep the mono on top. That's important. Don't let it spin around the hook. If it starts to move on you, shift it. Now, this comes down to another problem that I had with my gurglers in Pleasant Bay. You can see here, I don't want to go too far with my thread around the curve of the hook, because that makes it more difficult to compress when the fish hits it. It will skip away if you leave it short here. It won't skip away if you keep going around the bend, which is, I was trying to go super robust with my gurglers, and all I did was make a weed guard that turned out to be a fish guard. Okay, there's a bit left. I'm going to trim that off. There we go. Now I'm going to tie in my tail. If you have not done woolly buggers before, usually the tail is the length of the hook shank. Pinch loop it so it stays on top. Next our chenille, and you'll notice that I have stripped off a bit of the material, exposing the core, so that becomes a tying in point for me. Now I tie in my hackle. Now I just keep everything on top. And if that starts to get a little bit too close to the end, trim it off. Okay, now to wind on our chenille. Now leave a little bit more room at the eye of the hook than you might normally do with a woolly bugger. We need a bit of room to tie on the weed guard. Okay, now our hackle. What you can do is fold some of the barbs back so this last bit lays a little flatter. It wants to point back, it doesn't want to go forward. Now what I'll do is I'll back off and take a bit of my barbs off to create a bare stem. Now I've got a place to tie in that doesn't trap too many hackles. You can use your half hitch tool to push those barbs back if you've got any sticking forward. There we go. Now it's time to put in our weed guard. Feed it up through the eye and pull. You can see I've got it just almost touching the point of the hook. So grab it, put a couple of good tight turns in there. Now pull it hard back this way and put some more turns in. Now you can trim it off. Now what I'd like to do here is really make that head robust, so that weed guard will not pull out. Okay, now for some head cement, we'll use some UV glue and a little top coat to seal it. Okay, there we go. A very simple woolly bugger with weed guard attached. You can see some things I've done here. I've kept the weed guard fairly close to the point of the hook, and I haven't gone around the bend too much with my thread, because I want that weed guard to be able to push to one side. Now the last thing about this is how do you store this? Standard fly boxes that rely us to put the hook into something will bend that weed guard over and make it useless. So if you're going to store these flies, use a plastic box like this that doesn't require you to stick the hook in anything. And that way your hook guard stays level and proper shape the whole time it's stored. You don't have to worry about it. Pulled it out, it's ready to go. So there you go. Very, very simple fly. Not much to it. Shows you how to put a weed guard on. I think the key elements are a mono. I like that stiff saltwater mono, but I'm using a relatively light one because I don't want something so heavy that when the fish hit it, it actually pushes the fly away from the fish. I've left a good enough size head here so I can easily wind the weed guard on, and I haven't gone around the gape very far with my thread. That gives us the opportunity, or the fish I should say, the opportunity to push the weed guard out of the way when it hits. And as I say, you really don't need any more weed guard than is enough to deflect the fly when the weed guard hits a weed. If it's so stiff that the fish can't actually get a good grip on it, or you've added weight to the fly, now it wants to drive into the weed because it's heavy, you need a heavier weed guard. So I tend to go with unweighted flies for this technique. So there you go. A weedless woolly bugger. Cheers.
Got him. Get him out here. Oh, I bet you broke me off. Yeah, you did.